In the crowded courthouse, Maria walked in with a quiet resolve, her shoes clicking softly on the tiled floor. As she made her way to the bench, her eyes focused ahead as she approached the towering figure of Judge Thompson, who sat high up on the dais with a stern expression, his gavel resting on the desk, as if waiting for the next case to pass through his hands. The tension in the air was thick and palpable, and Maria felt the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. She had never been in a courtroom before, and the sight of it made her nerves tangle into knots inside her chest. She could hear the hum of conversations around her, the shuffle of papers, and the low murmur of lawyers preparing their arguments. Yet all of it seemed distant to her, as if she were in a bubble removed from the world. Her heart pounded in her ears, and she found herself focusing only on Judge Thompson and the case ahead of her today. Maria had always been someone who avoided trouble and followed the rules, whether it was paying her bills on time, volunteering at her local community center, or just making sure she drove carefully through the streets of the city. She did everything she could to stay out of trouble. Yet here she was in this cold room, accused of something she knew she hadn't done wrong. The infraction was minor, a small parking violation on a street she thought was clear. But somehow her vehicle had been cited for blocking a fire hydrant, something she hadn't noticed when she parked earlier that morning. She had every intention of paying her fine and moving on, but what she didn't expect was the fine to be as large as it was. As she stood before the judge, her palms started to sweat, and she had to swallow to keep her voice steady. When she spoke, her lawyer had advised her to stay calm, to let the facts speak for themselves. But something about the situation seemed to be making it harder to breathe. She had to force herself not to fidget, not to show how her hands were trembling as she held them together in front of her. Her lawyer had told her not to worry, but she couldn't shake the unease settling in her stomach. She glanced at the prosecutor, who was sitting across from her, flipping through a pile of papers with a look of indifference, and then back at Judge Thompson, who had yet to acknowledge her presence fully. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the paperwork in front of him, his brow furrowed as he read through the case details. Maria took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, reminding herself that this was just a formality, a simple matter to be cleared up. She would pay the fine and walk out of this room. But the longer she stood there, the more she felt like an outsider in a world she didn't belong to, a world of legalese and rules she didn't understand fully, as if she had stumbled into a strange land where even her simple explanation wouldn't be enough to convince the powers that be of her innocence. When the judge finally looked up at her, it felt like the entire room paused, his sharp eyes scanning her face, his expression unreadable. Maria forced herself not to flinch at the weight of his gaze. It was as though he was trying to measure her every word, every movement, and it made her feel smaller than she actually was. But she held his gaze, her voice steady, as she began to speak, explaining the situation as calmly as she could despite the nerves that continued to twist inside her chest, her hands no longer trembling, but instead tightly clenched in front of her. Judge Thompson listened to Maria's words with a mix of attention and detachment, his eyes never leaving her face as he absorbed her explanation. He didn't seem to react much at first, and Maria began to feel like she was talking to a wall, her voice echoing slightly in the large courtroom, as she explained that she had simply misjudged the space where she had parked and hadn't realized she was near the fire hydrant. The whole situation felt surreal to her. She was a person who prided herself on being meticulous, on following rules, and making sure everything in her life was in order, yet here she was explaining herself to a judge who seemed unmoved by her sincerity. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but it didn't feel warm or understanding. It felt cold and clinical, as if he was seeing her as just another case to be processed. Her explanation continued to hang in the air between them as Judge Thompson finally looked down at the papers on his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the surface, as if he were waiting for something to click or for an answer to emerge from the page. Maria shifted uncomfortably under the silence, the minutes stretching longer and longer. As she tried to remain composed despite the rising tension inside her, she glanced toward her lawyer, who gave her an encouraging nod, but it didn't do much to ease the tightness in her chest. Her mind wandered briefly back to the charity event she had been working on all week, the event that was just days away and that required every ounce of her energy. Yet here she was dealing with a small mistake that was threatening to derail her plans. Judge Thompson finally spoke, his voice firm and decisive. He told Maria that her actions had consequences, and that the fine was meant to serve as a reminder that even small mistakes could lead to bigger issues. He didn't seem to consider her circumstances or the fact that this was an isolated incident. Her carefully laid plans now felt like they were slipping from her grasp. She wasn't just standing in front of the judge for a simple parking ticket. She was standing in front of someone who had the power to change the course of her day, her week, even her life, with just a few words, and the weight of his authority seemed to press down on her shoulders. The fine he imposed was substantial, and as he spoke those final words, Maria felt a wave of frustration wash over her. The unfairness of it all seemed to flood her senses. How could a small mistake like this overshadow everything she had worked for? The judge hadn't even given her a chance to explain herself fully, to tell him what she had been doing to make a difference in the community. The charity event that was taking up all of her time and energy seemed so distant now, almost irrelevant in the eyes of the law. It was as if none of that mattered at all in this cold, sterile courtroom, where justice was a matter of procedure and not understanding. Her lawyer moved to speak, but Judge Thompson raised his hand, cutting him off. Maria stood still, her mind spinning. As the judge finalized the decision, he gave a curt nod, and then banged the gavel down with authority, signaling the end of the proceedings. She stood frozen for a moment, the words of the judge still ringing in her ears, before she gathered herself and slowly walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, but her heart heavy. The door shut behind her with a quiet thud. As she stepped back into the hallway, her thoughts swirling around the fine and how her efforts to make a difference seemed to have meant so little to the person who held all the power in this moment. As Maria walked down the corridor, her steps felt heavier than before, each footstep echoing in the empty space. She kept her head down, trying to process the weight of the fine and the overwhelming sense of injustice that had settled over her. She had been so focused on doing good for her community, giving everything she had to the charity event that had consumed her thoughts for weeks now. And yet here she was facing the consequences of a simple mistake, a misjudged parking spot that now seemed to overshadow everything. She had worked for. The event was days away, and now she would have to find a way to make up for the time lost dealing with this fine. Her frustration grew with each step, but there was also a sense of helplessness creeping in. She couldn't change what had just happened. The decision had been made, and now she would have to live with it. Just as she reached the courthouse exit, something unexpected happened. A young woman rushed toward her, holding a camera and a microphone in her hand. The reporter was out of breath as she stopped in front of Maria, catching her attention with a smile that seemed almost too bright for the moment. Maria stopped for a second, confused by the sudden appearance of the reporter, who was now speaking rapidly, her words tumbling out as she introduced herself as a local news reporter covering the upcoming charity event Maria had been organizing. Maria blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected any media attention. She wasn't doing this for recognition, but for the children who needed help, for the families in her neighborhood who had been struggling. And now here was this reporter asking about the event that Maria had been so focused on, as if it was the most important thing in the world. The reporter held out her phone, showing Maria a news clip from earlier in the day, a brief segment about the charity event that had already been making waves in the community. It seemed the media had caught wind of it, and the story was starting to spread faster than she realized. The reporter spoke excitedly about how the event was expected to be a major success, with local businesses contributing donations and volunteers rallying to the cause. Maria stood still for a moment, not sure how to react. The reporter's enthusiasm contrasted sharply with the frustration she had just felt in the courtroom. How could it be that her charity event was now a local story, and yet in that very same courthouse she had been treated like a common lawbreaker? She had never sought fame or attention. She was just trying to make a difference, and yet here it was staring her in the face. Maria answered the reporter's questions hesitantly, her mind still in a fog as she spoke about the children, the families, and the cause she had been working for so tirelessly. Her words felt distant, though, as if she was speaking about someone else's life, not her own. The reporter's questions continued, but Maria felt her focus drift as a sudden thought struck her. She had to get back to the courthouse. She couldn't let this moment slip by. She couldn't let her charity efforts be overshadowed by a simple misunderstanding. She had to make sure the judge knew what she had been doing, what she was truly about, and what she was trying to accomplish. The reporter handed Maria her contact information and wished her luck with the event, but Maria barely heard her words. Her mind was already racing back to the courtroom. She had to find a way to set the record straight, and maybe, just maybe, show the judge and the world that she wasn't just another person caught up in the system, but someone who was doing something that truly mattered. As Maria turned to walk back into the courthouse, a new determination burned in her chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and she would make sure that Judge Thompson would understand the real reason she had been standing before him. Maria returned to the courthouse with a sense of urgency, her heart pounding. As she walked through the doors once again, she had no idea what she would say or how she would even begin, but something inside her told her that she had to do this. She couldn't leave it like this, not after everything she had worked for and everything she was trying to achieve with the charity event. She had to make the judge see her not just as the person who made a small mistake, but as someone who was doing real work for the community, the work that truly mattered. She marched toward the receptionist at the front desk and asked if she could speak with Judge Thompson. She wasn't sure if it would be possible, but she had to try. She couldn't walk away feeling like she had been misunderstood. The receptionist looked up at Maria and blinked before she spoke, apologetically saying that the judge had a full docket for the rest of the day and wouldn't be able to meet with her. Maria's frustration surged again, but she tried to keep her voice steady as she explained the importance of what she was doing and how it was all coming up so soon. The receptionist hesitated for a moment before glancing at the schedule and then back at Maria. She said she would make a quick call to see if the judge could make time for her. Maria stood there, her nerves on edge, as the receptionist spoke into the phone, and then nodded toward Maria, telling her to wait. Maria's thoughts raced as she stood there waiting. She felt like a fish out of water, standing in a place that wasn't built for people like her, people who were trying to do something good, who had nothing to do with the mistakes the system often punished. She had always been the type to quietly help when needed, but now here she was asking for attention from the very system she had been trying to work within. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she couldn't back down now, not when so much was at stake. The future of the charity event depended on everything going smoothly, and this fine threatened to derail it all. She had to make the judge understand the bigger picture. After a few tense minutes, the receptionist hung up the phone and gave Maria a reassuring smile, saying that the judge had agreed to see her briefly. Maria's breath caught in her throat, and she felt a rush of hope. She was ushered into the back office of the courthouse and led to a small room where Judge Thompson was waiting for her, his expression unreadable. But Maria noticed the slight shift in his posture. As she entered, he gestured for her to sit, and she did so quickly, her palms sweating as she prepared to speak. Judge Thompson wasted no time with pleasantries. He simply asked why she had come back into his office. Maria took a deep breath and then began to explain herself. She told him about the charity event, the fundraiser she had been planning for months, and the importance of the work she was doing in her community. She spoke about the children who depended on the donations to help them succeed, the families who would receive food and clothing, and the volunteers who were all donating their time to make this event a success. She told him that she wasn't just some person making a careless mistake. She was someone who had been trying to make a difference in a world that so often overlooked people like her, people like the children she was helping. As she spoke, Maria could feel the judge's gaze softening just slightly, and she took that as a sign to keep going. She explained how the timing of the fine was disastrous, with the event just days away, and how it would only add to the stress of the situation. She wasn't asking for pity or special treatment, but for understanding, and maybe just a little leniency. She knew that mistakes were a part of life, but she hoped the judge would see that what she was doing was far more important than a momentary lapse in judgment over a parking space. She looked up at him, then, her voice firm, but filled with hope, waiting for him to respond. Judge Thompson listened in silence as Maria spoke, his eyes never leaving her face, his fingers steepled in front of him. As he processed her words, Maria felt her heart race. As she finished speaking, she had laid it all out for him. She had told him everything she could about the charity event and how important it was to her and the community. She had tried to make him understand the pressure she was under, the weight of everything on her shoulders, and how a small mistake had now threatened to undo all the hard work she had put into this cause. But there was still a sense of uncertainty in the air. As the judge remained silent, his expression unreadable. Maria couldn't tell if he was processing her words, or if he was simply waiting for her to finish before passing judgment again. For a few long moments, the room was still, and the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall. Maria felt her anxiety rise again. She had bared her soul to him. She had hoped that he would understand. But now she wasn't sure if he was even listening. She could feel the tension in the air thickening, and it made her stomach churn. She had given him everything she could, but it was out of her hands now. She had no more arguments, no more pleas to make. It was up to the judge to decide what would happen next. Finally, Judge Thompson leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her. Maria held her breath, waiting for him to speak, and when he did, his voice was lower than before. There was no anger or harshness in his tone, but there was something else. There's something that Maria couldn't quite place. He said that he understood her situation, that he recognized the effort she was putting into the charity event, and that he could see how much it meant to her. But he also reminded her that the law was the law, and that fines were meant to teach lessons and maintain order. Maria's heart sank as he spoke. She hadn't expected him to completely change his mind. But hearing those words stung. It was as if the system was telling her that everything she was doing didn't matter, that the rules were more important than the people she was trying to help. The judge paused for a moment, and Maria's mind began to race again, wondering if this was the end of the conversation, if there was any chance of getting through to him. She wanted to speak again, to argue her case more, but she knew that she couldn't push too far. That could make things worse. So she sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, as she waited for the judge to continue. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Thompson finally spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. He acknowledged that while the law had its place, there were also moments when it was important to consider the bigger picture. He said that Maria's actions in organizing the charity event were commendable, and that he didn't want to let this small mistake overshadow the good she was doing. He went on to say that he believed in second chances, and that he would be willing to reconsider the fine. Maria's eyes widened with surprise as she heard his words. She hadn't expected this turn of events. She had been prepared for the worst, but now it seemed like there might be a glimmer of hope. Maria felt a surge of relief rush through her as the judge continued, explaining that he would reduce the fine significantly in light of her efforts, and that he would make sure that her record reflected the positive impact she was having on the community. She blinked in disbelief at first, trying to process what she was hearing, and then a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Her shoulders relaxed, and the tension that had been building inside her slowly began to fade away. The judge wasn't letting her off the hook entirely, but he was showing her understanding in a way she hadn't anticipated. And for the first time since walking into this courthouse, she felt like she wasn't just a number or a case, but a person with a real story who mattered. Maria sat in stunned silence as the judge's words sank in her mind, still processing the unexpected turn of events. Her heart was still racing, but now there was a warmth spreading through her chest. She had expected the worst, but instead the judge was offering her a second chance, a chance to move forward without the burden of an overwhelming fine hanging over her head. She almost couldn't believe it. She had come into this courtroom feeling defeated and helpless, but now she felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She had expected to walk away with more stress and frustration, but instead she had found a glimmer of understanding and compassion in the most unlikely place. The judge continued to explain the details of his decision, while Maria listened intently. His words now seemed to carry more weight than ever before. He told her that the reduction of the fine would be put into effect immediately, and that he would make sure her charity work was taken into account in the official record. It was a small victory, but it felt like a huge one to her. She felt an overwhelming sense of relief as she realized that she would be able to focus on the event without constantly worrying about the fine or how it might impact her future. She was still going to have to work hard to make the event a success, but at least now she wouldn't be carrying the extra burden of an unjust punishment. The judge looked at her with a slight nod before saying that he hoped she would continue with her charitable efforts, and that he admired her commitment to making a difference in her community. His words felt genuine, and that struck Maria deeply. She hadn't expected to hear such praise from someone who had just imposed a fine on her, but now it seemed like he was seeing her in a new light, and that made her feel as though all the effort she had put into organizing the charity event was finally being recognized. She could feel the warmth of his words seeping into her spirit, and it gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She had been fighting so hard to make a difference, and now it felt like she had been given the support she needed to keep pushing forward. Maria stood up slowly. As the judge finished speaking, she felt a mix of gratitude and determination welling up inside her. She wanted to thank him, but the words didn't quite come out at first. She simply nodded at him, and then made her way toward the door, still processing everything that had just happened. As she stepped into the hallway, she couldn't help but feel like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had come into this place expecting nothing but judgment and frustration, but instead she had left with a renewed sense of purpose and a reminder that even when the system seemed stacked against her, there were still moments of understanding and grace. Outside the courthouse, Maria took a deep breath. As the cool air hit her face, it felt like the world had shifted slightly in her favor, and she could feel the energy surging within her. The charity event was still on track, and now she had one less thing to worry about. The stress and anxiety that had clouded her thoughts earlier had been replaced with a newfound sense of clarity. She knew there was still work to do, but now she felt more ready than ever to face the challenges ahead. She pulled out her phone and quickly sent a message to her team, letting them know that everything was back on track and that they could continue with the final preparations for the event. It was going to be a success, no matter what, and Maria knew that this was just one of the many moments she would face where she had to fight for what was right for her community and for the people who needed her most. Maria stood outside the courthouse for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle around her. The cool breeze gently brushed against her skin. As she looked up at the sky, the sun had begun to dip lower, and the golden light cast a peaceful glow across the street. For the first time all day, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The relief from the judge's decision had lifted her spirits and given her the energy she needed to keep moving forward. She had faced an obstacle, and now it was behind her, but the real work was still ahead of her. The charity event was only a few days away, and there was so much to do. Maria took out her phone and began typing quickly, sending another message to her team confirming the time and location for their next meeting. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. She needed to keep everything on track and make sure that the event went off without a hitch. As she sent the message, she felt a sense of pride for what she had already accomplished. Despite the setbacks, despite the challenges she had faced, she had managed to bring together a team of volunteers, local businesses, and supporters who believed in the cause. She had worked tirelessly to make this event a reality, and now it was all coming together. One final push was all it would take to make it a success, and Maria was determined to give it her all. She couldn't afford to lose focus now, not when the families and children who needed help were counting on her. She made her way down the steps of the courthouse and began walking toward her car, her mind still racing with the plans for the event and the tasks she needed to complete before the big day. She had no intention of letting the fine derail her or her mission. She had learned a valuable lesson through all of this, but it had only strengthened her resolve. She knew that life would always throw challenges her way, but what mattered most was how she responded and how she continued to fight for the things that truly mattered. As she reached her car and slid into the driver's seat, she felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination settle in her chest. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. As she drove through the streets of the city, the hustle and bustle of the world outside faded into the background. As she focused on what was ahead of her, she could already see the event taking shape in her mind. The laughter of children, the smiles of families who had been given a second chance, the feeling of accomplishment that would come with knowing she had made a real difference. Later that evening, she sat down at her desk to go over the final details of the event with her team. They had been working tirelessly to get everything in order, and now they were only days away from the big day. Maria felt a sense of excitement building within her. As she spoke to each person about their roles and responsibilities, she could feel the energy in the room, and it was contagious. Each volunteer was passionate and ready to give their best to make this event a success. Maria reminded them all that this wasn't just about raising money, it was about building a community and giving back to those who needed it most. They all nodded in agreement, and Maria could see the commitment in their eyes. She knew that they were all in this together, and that nothing could stop them now. The meeting wrapped up later than she had expected, but Maria felt energized and ready to tackle whatever came next. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid of them. She had faced adversity and had come out stronger, and now there was nothing that could stop her. As she walked out of the meeting room that night, she felt a sense of peace knowing that no matter what happened, the event would go forward, and that she was doing something that truly mattered to her community. She could take on anything now. The days leading up to the event were a whirlwind of activity, and Maria found herself pulled in every direction. As the final details were sorted out, the clocks seemed to be moving faster than ever, and she could feel the pressure mounting as the big day approached. But despite the chaos, there was a sense of excitement in the air. The event was going to be everything she had worked for and more, and as the pieces fell into place, she felt a growing sense of pride. She had faced the judge, the fine, and all the challenges in between. But now, she was on the brink of something truly special. The impact of the charity event was already being felt in the community. Even before the doors opened to the public, people were talking about it, spreading the word and sharing in the excitement of what was to come. Maria spent the next few days checking in with vendors, volunteers, and sponsors, making sure everything was set up and ready to go. She made sure every detail was perfect, from the food to the decorations to the logistics of the event space. Everything had to be flawless. The night before the event, she sat down with her team for a final run-through. Each person went over their tasks, and Maria felt a sense of relief as she saw how much everyone cared about the success of the event. It wasn't just about the fundraising or the recognition, it was about the families and children who would benefit from everything they had put together. It was about the good they were doing in the world and the difference they were making together. As the day of the event arrived, Maria woke up early with a rush of nerves, but also a quiet sense of confidence. She had done everything she could to prepare. Now, all she had to do was show up and let everything fall into place. She put on the event t-shirt, her jeans and sneakers, comfortable yet ready for anything. She smiled at her reflection in the mirror for a moment before gathering her things and heading out the door. Her car was packed with supplies and decorations, and as she drove to the venue, she felt a sense of anticipation building within her. She could already picture the crowd, the volunteers, the kids who would come to enjoy the event. Everything she had envisioned for months was finally coming to life. The venue was buzzing with activity. When Maria arrived, people were already setting up tables, arranging food and decorations, and welcoming the first few guests. Maria moved quickly through the crowd, greeting everyone with a smile and making sure everything was running smoothly. There was no time to stop or relax, not yet, but she could feel the energy in the air. It was infectious. Everyone was working together toward the same goal, and the excitement was palpable. Maria couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the people around her, for the volunteers who had given their time, for the donors who had made it possible, and for the families who were there to receive the support they so desperately needed. By mid-afternoon, the event was in full swing, and the energy in the room was electric. Maria watched as children played games and participated in activities, while their families enjoyed the food and entertainment. The atmosphere was one of joy and community, the kind of connection Maria had dreamed of when she first envisioned the event. It was working, it was all coming together. And as she stood there in the middle of it all, taking it all in, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment and fulfillment. The fine, the judge, the stress of the previous weeks, It all seemed distant now. What mattered was the work they had done and the lives they were touching. As the day wore on and the event began to wind down, Maria stood back for a moment to take it all, and she looked around at the smiling faces, the children laughing, the volunteers helping, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. Everything had come together, better than she could have imagined, and as the final guests began to leave, Maria knew that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. She had started with a dream, and now that dream had become a reality, and the impact would last far beyond this one day. As the final guests made their way out of the venue, Maria stood near the entrance, watching them go. The sense of fulfillment that had been building throughout the day was now overwhelming. It was as though all the hard work, all the late nights, and stressful moments had been worth it. She could see the smiles on the faces of the children, the gratitude in the eyes of the parents, and the sense of community that had blossomed around her. It was more than she had hoped for, more than she had imagined. When she first came up with the idea for the event, it had started as a small dream, and now it was something real, something that had made a difference in people's lives. Maria couldn't help but smile to herself as she looked around at the emptying room. The decorations had been taken down, the tables were being cleared away, but the feeling of joy and connection remained. Her team was still buzzing with excitement as they worked together to pack up and clean up after the event. Despite the exhaustion, they were all smiling, laughing, and talking about the success of the day. Maria walked over to them and thanked each person personally for their hard work. She knew that none of this would have been possible without them. The volunteers, the vendors, the sponsors, every single person had played a role in making the event what it was, and Maria was deeply grateful for all of them. As she shook hands and gave hugs to the people around her, she felt a deep sense of pride for everything they had accomplished together. Once the last of the cleanup was done and the venue had been emptied, Maria took a moment to sit down in the quiet room that had once been filled with so much energy. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the silence wash over her. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the struggles, the setbacks, and the triumphs, and she realized that this was just the beginning. The event had been a success, but there was so much more to be done. There were more families to help, more children to support, and more communities to reach out to. Maria knew that she couldn't stop now, not when there was still so much work to do. She stood up from the chair and grabbed her phone, sending a quick message to her team, thanking them once again for everything they had done, and letting them know that the next steps were already in motion. There was no time to rest, not when there was so much more potential to tap into. Maria felt the fire within her burning brighter than ever before. As she looked at the message she had just sent, she knew that this event would lead to even greater things. There were already people reaching out, asking how they could get involved in future events, how they could contribute, and Maria couldn't wait to bring them all in to continue the work they had started. Later that night, as Maria sat down at her desk to go over the final numbers from the event, she felt a sense of exhaustion settling in. But it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that made her want to give up. It was the kind that made her feel accomplished, the kind that made her feel like she had done something truly meaningful, something that mattered. Maria looked at the numbers on the screen, but it wasn't the dollars raised that made her feel proud. It was the lives she had touched and the connections that had been made over the course of the day. She had started with nothing but an idea, and now she had built something bigger than herself, something that would continue to grow and reach even more people in the future. She knew it wouldn't always be easy, but she was ready for whatever came next, because she knew that she had the strength to face it and the support of her community behind her. As the days passed after the event, Maria found herself reflecting on everything that had happened, the hustle of the final preparations, the nerves before the doors opened, and the overwhelming joy as the event unfolded. It all felt like a blur now, but in the best possible way. The aftermath of the event brought with it a sense of calm and peace. that Maria hadn't expected, but also a sense of excitement for what was to come. She had proven to herself that no obstacle was too great to overcome, and that the impact she could have on her community was far greater than she had ever imagined. Every person she had met, every conversation and connection she had made had shown her that the power of working together could create change. She thought back to the moment when she had stood in the courtroom, facing the judge, uncertain of what would happen, and she realized how much had changed since then, how far she had come since that moment of fear and frustration. In the days that followed, Maria began receiving messages from people in the community who had been touched by the event, parents thanking her for giving their children a chance to have fun and feel supported, volunteers expressing their gratitude for being part of something that made a real difference, and even local businesses expressing interest in partnering with her for future events. It was exactly what Maria had hoped for when she first dreamed of the event. She wanted to create a space where people could come together to help one another, and that was exactly what had happened. The ripple effect of the event had already started to spread, and Maria couldn't wait to see where it would go next. She had a sense that this was just the beginning, that the momentum was building, and that the work she had started would continue to grow and impact even more lives. One evening, Maria found herself sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea in hand as she went over her plans for the future. The charity event had been a huge success, but she knew there was more to be done. She had so many ideas swirling in her mind, so many ways to expand the work she was doing in the community, and she was determined to make them all happen. She felt an undeniable sense of responsibility to keep pushing forward, to keep helping the people who needed it most, and to ensure that her efforts didn't stop at just one event. It was a long road ahead, but Maria was more ready than ever to take on whatever challenges came her way. The success of the charity event had shown her that when you stay committed to a cause, when you believe in something bigger than yourself, the rewards are far greater than you could ever expect. She was ready to face the next chapter of her journey with a clear vision and an unwavering determination. The lessons she had learned from the past few months would stay with her forever: the importance of resilience, the power of community, and the incredible impact that can be made when people come together for a common purpose. As Maria looked out the window of her home, she could see the city lights twinkling in the distance, and she thought about all the possibilities that lay ahead. She knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would continue to grow and reach people who needed help and support. And for the first time in a long time, Maria felt truly at peace with the path she was on, knowing that she was doing the right thing and that she was making a real difference in the world, one step at a time.